Hello and welcome everyone. Tonight we are going to be doing a presentation on proposed revisions for cultivated oyster mariculture regulations. So as part of this, we have a few reminders that I'm going to go over before we get the presentation started. And again, we'll have a presentation. We're going to go Q&A, question and answer, and then we'll have the public comment portion. So as a reminder, to submit a question, Q&A is going to be through typing. So you will have on your screen the Q&A button you should see at the bottom. And so you'll click on that and then you can type in your questions. You can submit questions anytime during the presentation, but we're not going to start answering those until the end of the presentation. Also, remember that even though the buttons are there, the chat function, the emojis, and or the raise your hand and the reaction are going to be disabled during this. Again, if you need to submit a question, you put it in the Q&A. Okay, so now on to our presentation on proposed revisions to the Cultivated Oyster Mariculture Program regulations. For those who may not be as familiar with cultivated oyster mariculture, or as we abbreviated COM, and I'll be using that abbreviation throughout this presentation. This activity was authorized by the 86th legislature via House Bill 1300 in May of 2019. In August of 2020, the commission, having been granted permission to regulate and develop rules for cultivated oyster mariculture, passed regulations, and the program took effect in August of 2020. And our first COM permit was issued in July of 2021. Since that time, we now have 11 grow-out sites. So our grow-out sites, sometimes called farms, are where oysters are grown to that harvestable market size where they're harvested for consumption. And we have 11 in what we call a conditional permit status. Those have been approved by TPWD, but they're currently gaining other agency authorizations for the activity. We also have 2 nurseries and 2 hatcheries, and these are where oysters are produced and grown in early life. Since harvesting began in 2022, over 1.5 million oysters have been harvested, and that number is growing every month. And on average, a little bit different than our wild oysters, mariculture oysters, where they're intended for that half shell raw market. So they're sold singly, and our farmers are getting on average 67 cents per oyster. It can be vary from different types of categories, whether they sell directly to an individual or to a restaurant. So why are we making amendments? These are to clarify and refine program rules. When the program started, it was brand new to Texas, so we anticipate as it grew and developed that there would be needed changes or alterations to what we had. And so these are based on feedback from our TPWD biologists, game wardens, our COM industry members, and with guidance from our partners at Texas Department of State Health Services and the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, what we call the NSSP, and that's the rules adopted by the FDA that govern the health and safety of oysters across the nation. To give you kind of a roadmap of where we're going, our topics. So I'll hit some of the major revisions, our topics such as tumbling and sorting, permit transfers, the sunset provision, size limit change, and then onto a section that has more of clarification. So covering a lot of different things, not real major revisions, just tweaking wording for clarifications. And then finally, a section on repeals that, because of other proposed changes, would make some portions ineffective. Our first topic is tumbling and sorting, and this is just to specify in code that farmers may take oysters out of their permitted area to a land-based shore for tumbling and sorting. Tumbling is a mechanical process whereby oysters are sorted through size. This is a common practice in mariculture, and while some farmers are able to and do conduct this activity on boats out in their permitted site, due to our Texas wave and wind energy and just weather in general, sometimes it's not feasible or safe for our farmers to do that. So our code had been silent on this. And so we just want to make sure ensured in our code now that yes, the farmers may do this, provided that the oysters be returned to their permitted area prior to harvest. Next, we propose to allow for permit transfers. These permits are very long, they're 10 years, and as the activities result in businesses and result in products that are for businesses, it is just reasonable that with that there may be transfers or changes to the business side of our permit holders over time. And therefore, to allow the permit to be transferred instead of all that gear having to be taken out and moved, since these are based on location, this would be less disrupted both to our natural resources and to the processing and business side of this. There will be a application fee or transfer fee, which is really an application fee of $200. Next, we want to propose the extension of what we call the sunset provision. So within code, we specify that oysters used in mariculture must come from Texas broodstock and be from Texas-based hatcheries and nurseries. However, since this industry was new and is establishing, there was the sunset provision that allowed for the use of a non-Texas tetraploid line, so that's produced in triploids, and using of out-of-state hatcheries and nurseries until December of 2027. Now, working with our industry partners, so the industry is developing this tetraploid line of oysters, and based on conversations with them, the development, but not only the development, but the stabilization of the line, the distribution, and getting that up and running at other hatcheries would likely not all occur before 2027. Also, currently we only have one commercial scale hatchery in Texas. So with all of these, we propose to extend the sunset provision to 2033 to allow more time for the industry to be established and this line to be developed. We propose to change the harvest size limit from 2.5 inches to 2 inches. Now, when we started, after we have seen these oysters and our game wardens have seen these oysters, the ability to distinguish the mariculture oysters from wild oysters, we're more confident that we can do that and at smaller sizes. So there would be less likelihood of chance of someone trying to mistake mariculture oysters for wild oysters. And along with this, we will add in, like the wild oyster industry, that 5% allowance of the cargo between 1.5 and 2 inches, just realizing inherently when you're sorting through all, there's one or a few may fall through that aren't right at that size limit. Now we're on to our section of clarifications. So our first clarification is proposing to change the name of the permit from the COM nursery only permit to a COM nursery hatchery permit and expand the text around that to include hatchery activities. As many hatcheries also serve as nurseries, it's just more efficient to combine these into one, together into one permit type. We'd like to refine the text on the rules about oyster seed grown in prohibited and restricted waters to mirror that of the NSSP. So just clearly separate those out as they're treated two different ways depending on where those are grown. And make sure our language really matches the NSSP so there isn't any confusion between the two. And just as a reminder, that NSSP are the federal approved rules governing health and safety for oysters across the nation. We also want to specify resubmergence requirements for oysters prior to harvest. This, again, it is already part of the NSSP, and since our state has adopted and it's by the NSSP rules, all of our farmers already comply with this. But to really make sure for just health and safety reasons and to have this up front, so not having to check multiple documents, we just want to clarify that in our text that if oysters have been out of the water beyond the time to temperature window for any reason, be that desiccation, tumbling and sorting, or even during those summer months when that time to temperature window is much smaller, just sorting bags, sorting through, splitting bags. So for any reason those oysters are out of the water beyond the current time to temperature window, they would need to be resubmerged for 2 weeks prior to harvest. We would like to allow for our gear tags, so all of the gear has to be tagged for identification, but allow that a phone number can be used instead of or in place of an address on those gear tags. On to kind of more of our revisions. So these are processes we already have in place, how to add a sub-permittee and oyster transport authorization. Just revise the text to make it much more clear about how these processes are conducted and the steps for those. So with our oyster transport authorization, anytime oysters are being moved around the state, they need to be identified and identified identified in one form or another, whether that be they've been harvested, so they have that harvest tag or dealer tag on them, or if they're moving oyster seed, they have identification and a paper trail on that. And that's also protection for both our industry members and the public, just that there is a record of that and somebody's not doing something illegal with your oysters. So our next clarification is allow for our public meeting notifications to be on the TPWD website and add in the option for the virtual meetings. So virtual meetings were started, they've been very effective, but make sure that's in code to allow for that. Finally, our last clarification is adding the harvest authorization. So this is something we are already in compliance with, but it's just formalizing our internal practices to more explicitly meet the NSSP requirements that a harvest authorization be only for a 1-year period. While this is done through checks, annual fees, inspections, submitting annual reports, those are kind of the internal processes that do that. We just want to make sure that people aren't confused when they see that permit that has that 10-year valid period, that's not confused with that harvest authorization that is re-upped every single year. Finally, we have some items that we're proposing for repeal. Again, these are just to remove things that are no longer needed due to other changes that we propose, such as oyster seed hatchery, with our permit being the nursery hatchery. This would no longer be needed. The agency's decision to refuse to issue or renew a permit, we're not getting rid of that. We're just adding this to a chapter that was put in place after the Mariculture rules were put in place. That is the agency's uniform ways to cover those. And so we're just going to add com to that and repeal this. And finally, prohibited acts. Now, don't worry, anything that was already prohibited and illegal is still going to be prohibited. We just, when reviewing, realized that the prohibited acts section was redundant to text that was already elsewhere in the general provisions section or the other portions of the code. So just to remove those redundant items, there were 2 items that were not redundant, so we've moved those items up into the general provisions. So again, everything that was prohibited, still going to be prohibited, just cleaning up some of those redundancies. So that was our quick coverage of the proposed rules. You can find the full text on our website, and there, if you, the website, so let me go forward real quick, kind of go over the next steps. And so the next step is the public comments portion. So it's open for public comment. It will be open until November the 6th. And you can submit public comment by phone, by email, and on the TPWD website at our public comment portal. There has all the items that are currently up for public comment that you can do that. These items will be presented at the November commission meeting. That one's going to be located in Corpus Christi on November 7th. It'll be up the Thursday up before the commission, and that's a time where the public can also come and give comment there. And that's when the commissioners will vote on whether they will adopt these or not adopt these. So I'm going to go back one step. Now we're going to open for questions. So if you have any questions right now about the proposed regulations, need some clarifications, this is the portion to type in those questions, submit. Again, it'll be that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. During the public comment period, we won't be answering questions then. So right now, if you have any questions about the proposed items, go ahead and type in the question box. I am going to put up the slide that has the next steps and give everyone a minute to type in those questions if you need to. Do you have a question, want to clarify about these amendments? We have really searched and focused on the amendments that are going to be most effective and for the efficiency of our program and for others. So right now, that's what we're focusing on. There may be a time in the future where there may need be more revisions. But right now, these are the proposed changes. There's always the ability to go back at a later date and time if further revisions are needed. You can email us, call us, or submit public comment on our website. Also, on our website at the public comment portal, you can see the full text of the proposed amendments as published in the Texas Register. With that, we'll close out for the evening. Okay, thank you, everyone.